Hello, everybody. I am back with another edition of the Wild Roof podcast. Today, I have a new guest to join me, Father Isaac Slater, and I'll go through a few of his previous publications. There's one in particular, which is a new release this year, which we will speak about in more depth. But just to give you the official rundown, he is the author of the poetry collection, Surpassing Pleasure, the book Beyond Measure, The Poetics of the Image in Bernard of Clairvaux, a forthcoming title, This and That, which is a translation of short poems of Zen Master Ryōkan, and the current book, which I mentioned, is called Do Not Judge Anyone, Desert Wisdom for a Polarized World. Father Isaac is a Trappist monk at the Abbey of the Genesee, and we'll speak a little bit more about his tradition there and the idea of being a contemplative monk in 2025 and what that might mean in the context of being a writer and thinker as well. So welcome. If there's anything else you'd like to add as far as your background, you can do that. But welcome and thanks for joining me.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here. Some of those titles I'll mention are published under my legal name, John Slater. So I kind of go by both. Mostly the poetry is published under John Slater, and the more monastic studies type stuff is published under Isaac, my split personality.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the collection Surpassing Pleasure, for example, is under John Slater. First things first, just kind of to talk a little bit about your background as a writer, entering into this book here, but also in your poetry. So I'm just curious in terms of even like back to formative experiences as a creative person, where do you draw your interest in writing from and creativity?
Yeah, it was really second nature. I mean, I wrote ever since I was a small child. I was a bit precocious with reading. I loved to read, and I started writing quite young. And when difficult things happened in my childhood, writing was really a huge refuge. And I had, at least when I was around 11, 12, I had one teacher who was really kind of bohemian and just saw the gift I had for writing and encouraged me so, so much. And that was a big support and inspiration. And then later too, like I found a lot of good teachers came my way and people that encouraged me at key points. Around the time I was about 16, 17, I ran across this anthology of poetry, which you may know, called The Enlightened Heart by Stephen Mitchell. And it's an anthology of poems from different mystical traditions. And that book really just opened something up for me. It planted a seed really of my vocation, both as an adult writer and as a monk to be. So it was really an important turning point. It was like suddenly I saw a way for language to become transparent. It was like it opened up onto another dimension within myself as well. And so that was pretty crucial. And I had a good teacher around that time who was able to support that direction as well. And then even my attraction to monastic life. So we live in a community which spends a lot of time in silence and solitude. It's quite a scripted life in some ways, but you also have a lot of time, open, unscripted time as well each day. And it's kind of like living inside of a poem, like living inside of a sonnet. It's very structured and regulated, but there's also the possibility for compressed, very powerful expression precisely because of the limits. And anyway, the part of me that was a writer felt attracted to monastic life, partly because it's like living inside a poem, but also because I just felt that it would be somewhere conducive to living and writing and working and sort of healing my own wounds creatively as well as otherwise.
That is an interesting framework. Yeah, I never had considered what living inside of a poem would be like. but I can yeah instantly see what you mean with the structure and then the freedom within the structure, having kind of that impulse to be creative. Because that's kind of a counterintuitive way to say, yeah, the form imposes the limits, but also the inspiration to work around those limits or to work within them. Maybe you could share a little bit about what do you mean by this the structured solitude life? What does that look like for somebody who hasn't been inside of a monastery or spent time even maybe as a layperson in a retreat setting or something like that?
Sure. So, I mean, the skeleton is the schedule, or as we call it, the horarium. And 7 times a day, a bell rings and we drop what we're doing and go to the church and pray the Psalms together, sing, chant psalmody. And that those periods can last anywhere from 10 to 45 minutes. And then throughout the rest of the day, the day is kind of broken up in periods of manual work. We support ourselves by our work rather than donations or other means. And we also have time for reading and time for silent meditation and prayer and so on. So there's kind of a nice rhythm to the day once you internalize it. It takes some getting used to, especially getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning for vigils. That takes some getting used to. But once you internalize the structure, it becomes kind of second nature and it's quite a support. And you live a very full day and your experience of time changes in interesting ways. But another image for the structure that I like, you can think of it as a poem or like a sonnet or some like very formal style of poem. It's also can be compared to a trellis in a garden that your climbing hydrangea or ivy or something would crawl up this trellis. And the regimen of daily practice is like that trellis in the garden. And if you're the climbing hydrangea, you're just there in a clump on the ground being eaten by rodents and not really going anywhere. But once you have that trellis, you can start to climb. You have something to resist and pull against, and you can spread out. And the hope is that the person can reach a kind of fuller articulation than they would without having that structure. And I've been here for 25 years, and that's really been my experience. It's really helped me to grow enormously.
That's quite a striking image as well. And I think one that makes, it's very practical in a sense when people can kind of grasp onto that. One of the things that's so appealing about the new book, before we get into into some of the particulars, is kind of how you, from this perspective, inside the monastery, an enclosed monastery, want to engage with the outside world, the contemporary world, our issues out here that many people deal with. And what was either the inspiration or the impulse to say it's not just theoretical, it's not just contemplative, it's not just study of the ancient texts or something, it's something that really is relevant and that people who don't come from maybe even a religious tradition or background can access and very, very much find relevance, in that book. So what was the maybe yeah, the impulse to write about these more contemporary issues?
Sure. So one of the Desert Fathers, that is one of the early monks, was named Evagrius, and he said that a monk is somebody who goes apart from all, who withdraws from all for the sake of all. So the monk is going into solitude in solidarity with the human family, and in order to go deeper into the human condition, not to escape from the world. And all of the issues in the world are issues that originate in the human heart that we share. So if a person is going deeper into the human condition, this is what they're wrestling with in themselves and so on. Now, that said, being a monk doesn't make you an expert on human affairs, or I don't have any special insight. My view is just one more view. But the impetus for the book was being in the cloister inside the monastery, which can be like a pressure cooker or a hothouse. And, I had given some of the material in the book. The book is about these first monks, the Desert Fathers, and how they emphasized the teaching of Jesus, judge not and you will not be judged. Well, these first monks made that kind of the center of their whole practice. They focused in a very strong way on the saying, like, if you only do not judge another, if you could really understand what this meant and put it into practice, that's all you need to do. That's the heart of the gospel for them. I was struck by that. There's a number of powerful stories and sayings about these desert fathers and mothers, and I reflect on them in the book in the light of contemporary experience. So, I had given some of this material. I had assembled the different sayings and stories of the desert fathers related to not judging and given it as a retreat at another monastery. But then shortly after that, COVID struck and George Floyd was murdered, and there was the uprising in response to that, and there was the election, the second round, and that is 2020, and all of the rancor and the increased so-called polarization and so on. Well, I mean, during COVID, you're locked in a community with 20 other people who may not share your views, and in this case, don't on many questions. You had to find a way to work through all of that. So that was some of the context in which the book started to come together.
Yeah, from that perspective, you might think in the title like the polarized world as, society at large, but I think we could, it's kind of fractal, like, right, we can go as micro as we want to it. I mean, you mentioned some of those, the desert fathers and their sayings. You open the book with one little vignette of, I think as a monk is caught with a woman, and would you share that little
Sure.
scene? Because that's
Yeah.
right at the beginning of the book, and I think that sets a good tone.
Yeah, it's a great story. So the usually the way the Desert Fathers were organized, there was an Abba that is like the leader of the community who was kind of a charismatic figure, and he would assemble a group of students around him, disciples. And in this case, the students come running to their master and say that they've seen a woman going into the cell of one of their brothers, which of course is forbidden. They're living a celibate life. And they're all worked up and they want to have this guy punished, right? Call him to account. And so the Abba says, what are you telling me he's there with a woman? And he starts shouting. And when I catch that so and so, I'm going to let him have it. And he's shouting louder and louder as they approach the cell. And then they storm into the room, and the monk is there. And there's not so much furniture or anything in the room. There's just this laundry hamper, and the Abba goes right over and sits on the hamper, crosses his arms, and says to the other monks, you search every square inch of this room till you find that woman. And they search and search and they can't find her. And then he lays into the monks and he says, who are you to dare accuse your brother? And he gives them a harsh penance, bread and water for the next week, and don't you dare accuse another, and so on and so forth. So they all go out of the room, and he gets up from off of the laundry hamper, and the stunned monk is standing there, and he says to him, "Be careful, be careful," and then he leaves. That's it. This is a great story from a number of angles, but in part, it's kind of a more humorous version of the account in the Gospel of John of Jesus and the adulterous woman, when the Pharisees bring a woman who's caught, we're told, in the very act of adultery somehow, which makes you wonder if it wasn't a setup. And then she's brought before Jesus, and he has to kind of de-escalate things in a way similar to this Desert Father. So it shows the Desert Fathers putting into practice in a very concrete way this in a very creative improvisational way this teaching of Jesus. And my book kind of wonders, like, where did this go in Christianity? Most of us associate, rightly or wrongly, or have real experiences with a very moralistic and narrow face of Christianity. At the very least, it's perceived that way often. Why is that? Where did this teaching on not judging go?
One might wonder of like, well, what does the, something so far in the past have to tell us today or something, right? I mean, that's such a contemporary little scene, and that's why it's so relevant. So nicely sums it up. I'm not sure if this is kind of the same concept as that scene, but I'll see what you think. Because one of the concepts you talk about is over acceptance in terms of what is this response to a situation that could be judged, or this kind of improvisational approach that you mentioned. So yeah, what is this over acceptance idea?
Yeah. This from a book by Samuel Wells, who's a moral philosopher, theologian. He has a book called Improvisation, the Drama of Christian Ethics, in which he argues that, you know, living a moral life is not like following a script where you can just turn to the back of a book and know what you're supposed to do in every situation that arises in life. But it's much more like improvisation, like the kinds of drama games that actors do to hone their skills at improv. And he talks about these different games, and they involve one actor giving the other what's called an offer. So the one actor starts a drama in a certain direction, a scenario, right? And the next actor has to respond to that and take it up and make something creative with it to move the drama forward. And the second actor can either block the offer, which they're not open to going in that direction. They want to just take the ball and go home. They don't want to play, or they can accept it, which is to just kind of mirror it or go along with it. But the aim is to over accept, where it's a yes and, where you take up the offer that the other gives you, the direction for the drama that they suggest, and you spin it in some wild, unforeseen direction.
It's such an interesting thought experiment, right? Because I mean, going back to that little scene about the brother getting caught with a woman, the Abba could have been denouncing the brother who got caught, right, and saying you're out of here, so something like that, kind of going along with the people who found out. But yeah, in that sense, it goes beyond that. He was so upset that it gave the warning to the person to say, "I'm coming, watch out," which gave them the opportunity to provide this lesson, right, to everybody.
Right. And
Um,
surely, I mean, that brother is not going to fall into this again. He was just lynched by his brothers. He's not going to forget, right? Like at the end of the woman caught in adultery, Jesus says, "Go and sin no more." Like she doesn't need Jesus to lay into her about, hey, remember, don't do any more adultery, or like, of course, she's just about been stoned to death. This is going to be imprinted. She's already like traumatized here, right? She doesn't need him. So he's just very gentle, you know, and same with this Abba. He sees that it's already taken effect. He doesn't need to add anything, like it's much more effective this way, where the person having almost been stoned to death receives mercy and gentleness, and that's going to move them more to change than anything else. I also mentioned in the book this principle in Bernard of Clairvaux, a 12th century monk in our tradition, and he says that you can move a person to make a change in their behavior in the short term by fear, by threatening them with punishment. And you may get a little further by offering some reward or making a deal with them, the carrot rather than the stick. But if you want to move a person to change themselves from within freely, it's only the experience of being unconditionally loved that prompts a person to want to change. So paradoxically, it's only the experience that we don't need to change in order to be loved that moves us to want to change. You know, it's a very powerful principle that I think is really true to life.
yeah, excellent. And another kind of offshoot maybe is a section that's called "Do Not Judge Yourself."
Mm.
And so people maybe in a commonplace setting might hear some of these phrases, or they might kind of resonate more as cliches at times. So do not judge yourself. It doesn't mean just do whatever you want. It's fine. Right. So it's like And some of these there's a little trick here, like, would it be fair to say maybe like a non-dual perspective of by not judging other people, you're also not judging yourself, and by not judging yourself, it kind of goes both ways in that sense. Is there something you could add on like the self-judgment
Yeah, I
concept?
mean, the measure you measure out is the measure that will come to you, Jesus says, right? And, modern psychology will say that people pick up on the way your attitude towards yourself, right? If you are very self-deprecating and you don't have a lot of self-respect, people will pick up on that and treat you like dirt without even meaning to. They'll treat you with less respect, even if they're not unkind or unjust. Still, without even being conscious of it, they will perhaps look down on you somewhat unconsciously. And conversely, if a person has a decent and healthy self-respect and so on, then other people will pick that up. Oh, this is a basically sound and confident person, and they'll treat them with a little more respect, again, without even really adverting to it. And the idea with judging ourselves, which of course we all do, right? We all have some kind of inner critic that we have to come to terms with in some way, hopefully to integrate it, and we can fall into the trap of judging ourselves for being judgmental, right? And then you just go around and around in circles. Um, but it can be quite subtle in some ways. Like I do touch on in the book. I don't deal with it as fully as the problem deserves, maybe. But, you know, when we hear about this not judging, we can think of all kinds of counterexamples, right? Like, what about the wife who's beaten by her husband or this or that? Situation of injustice where it seems like, she's just making excuses for her husband. She needs to get the kids and get out of there. She doesn't need to make excuses for the husband. That's not what the Desert Fathers or Jesus mean by not judging. They mean not judging anyone at all. And in those situations, what's happened is that the victim is judging themselves instead of, like they've turned the judgment on themselves. I'm worthless. I deserve this. I don't, you know what I mean? Like, and so they don't step up and make a break when one is called for. But actually to behave vindictively and with wrath and so on is not productive. It's not the most effective way forward. To respond with violence to violence doesn't get you anywhere. You're still kind of rebounding off the other person's energy, destructive energy, and you're not making a really free response. So, like when Jesus says, never resist an evildoer, that's what he means. When the mob comes and they're ready to lynch one of the monks, that Abba pretends to play along initially, but actually what he's doing is spinning the whole situation in a totally new direction. He's responding from a place of terrific freedom and creativity in the face of this mob. And we can't underestimate how contagious and attractive it is to join the mob. There's something very primal in us that wants to join the lynch mob, and it's very hard to deconstruct and find a way to respond from another level. It's only if we're constantly practicing day in and day out in little ways this approach to not judging, and if that a practice of not judging is emerging from an interior life, a practice of meditation, where we're practicing not judging at the level of our thoughts. See, if we take this attitude, we're spending time each day in stillness, where whatever arises into consciousness, we just become aware of it and let it be there. And we cultivate this kind of non reactivity that leaks out and spills over into our relationships and our not judging at the level of morality.
That's yeah, very very interesting, and yeah, I think that's something people can experiment with in their own lives I think, pretty readily. And yeah, it's important to make an acknowledgement like that, that not judging people doesn't mean there's not bad behavior or harmful behavior, or to put it mildly, right? It's not an instruction to like put your head in the sand, ignore things, and that kind of thing, of course, right? So thanks for like expanding on that. And yeah, I think even the going back to kind of the self-judgment or self-blame is one that I think, yeah, really resonates with people too. And one thing that I thought of in particular is like, are you familiar with the Lojong mind training slogans in Buddhism? There's
No,
one, there's like
I don't think
this
so.
collection of 59 little nuggets of instruction, and one of them is drive all blames into one, which is kind of can be like, what the heck does that mean? And it's one of those kind of two-sided phrases, like, well, let's blame myself for everything, like what the heck? But it kind of goes along with that kind of approach where you take responsibility for what happens to you. Like if you're experiencing it, it doesn't mean somebody else didn't do something wrong or some that you're not affected by other things. What's the best response to what happened is like to say, okay, what was my hand in it? What was my role in it? And then where to go from there. So yeah, there's like this very kind of clear practicality once you kind of crack the code a little bit with some of these nuggets. So yeah, what else? Well, I think just in general terms, you do bring in some figures of like Zen Buddhism, Dojin, you quote. What are some of those other connection points, whether it's like philosophy or other religious traditions, literature that you find you can pull in and they help tell the story in your book?
Yeah, I think when you're working on a book like this, it's a lot of synchronous, fortuitous connections start to happen. You have certain ideas bubbling and you're continuing to read and be in the world, and things just come into the orbit of what you're working on. And that was my experience here. There were a number of things that, as I was working on the core of the book, the nucleus is these sayings, the stories of the Desert Fathers, but very often other things that I had read or was reading connected quite closely. And so there are numerous sayings from Simone Weil, the French mystic and philosopher, that connect just perfectly, I think, with the themes of the book. And there's a section on Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov as well, where the elder Zosima takes this approach similar to what you were just saying a moment ago about driving all blames into one. And his spiritual teaching, which has to be understood in the context of the book and so on, but the gist of it is that I am guilty to all for everything, that I take the blame on myself rather than pushing it out onto others. Now, again, that could be very misunderstood in the case like the abused wife who's blaming herself for her husband's violence and so on. That's not what he's talking about, because again, she's uh, judging herself very harshly. She's turned the violence on herself. And Zosima's idea is of this universal compassion. And it's one of the epigrams at the beginning of the book is something like, until there can be no universal brotherhood until one becomes a brother to all, right? So that's another important dimension, is the universality of this practice of not judging. It can't be not judging for some, but not for others, right? Like you see that in the contemporary political discourse. Both sides are concerned for victims, for example, but only certain classes of victims. And they're crass and callous and worse towards other kinds of victims. So one side may be very concerned about the unborn and totally ruthless towards Palestinians or immigrants, and vice versa. Uh, yeah, so you get the point. But this is the idea that the opposite of judging, the problem with judging is that we build up a sense of self by positioning ourselves over and against another group or person or idea, right? And this reinforces my sense of self. It gives me a boost by putting someone else down. It's the same dynamic in the schoolyard in kindergarten, right up to Congress or wherever else. You see the same dynamic, right? And the alternative to that in the Desert Father tradition is instead to be with and for all, to be with and for all. So, for instance, Jesus will say, "Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect, for he makes his rain fall and his sun shine on the just and the unjust alike, and he himself is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked." That's what we're called to. I mean, you're mentioning a non-dual approach. Well, that's as non-dual as it gets, it seems to me, right? That God is constantly loving into being everyone and everything. Mother Teresa and the serial killer are both emerging from the bottomless wellspring of divine love and held in being by that same love with great tenderness and care. The difference is that one is completely closed themselves off to that care and they've hardened themselves, and the other is open and porous.
Yeah, that reminds me of the phrase, it's early in the book, but original innocence,
Mhm.
which coming from a slightly more Buddhist perspective is a phrase called fundamental goodness, right? So, or basic goodness. And yeah, I mean, is that kind of, does that go along with that concept a little bit? Like the the badness that we see is not fundamental in the sense of like that's who people are, or that's their nature, or that's human nature even. It's a covering up of the goodness or the innocence of our humanity and what's actually at the core of, to use that
Yeah,
as a metaphor, metaphorically speaking.
yeah,
Does that kind of
but
go along with that?
definitely. Yeah, I mean, the monastic tradition speaks of our being in the image, like Genesis speaks about we're made in the image and likeness of God. Human beings are made in the image and likeness of God. And the monastic tradition talks about how our being in the image is this kind of ineradicable goodness or integrity, the fundamental dignity of the human person that cannot be destroyed no matter what happens. And this is taken up in some Christian traditions more than others. It's certainly at the core of Catholic tradition, the dignity of every human person, ineradicable, no matter what. Our being in the image of God, the likeness becomes distorted and needs to be healed and restored to harmony and alignment with the image. And in certain Buddhist traditions, like the Soto Zen tradition, will emphasize how, we're already awake and our fundamental nature is just we have to unlearn and forget the illusion of the small self that we take to be all of ourselves, so on. So, yeah, points of contact there.
Yeah, yeah, that resonates for sure. So maybe one like practical scenario I'll throw out to you, and then we can move into maybe a poem you could share with us. In speaking in like day-to-day life terms, we close the podcast, we go about our day, we turn on the TV or go on social media. What do we see? The media propagates fear, anger, exactly what you're saying not to do is judge other people for their views or their actions, whatever. Um, so when we encounter that next time, even just on the screen later today, like what should a person do? What could a person do once we kind of recognize, okay, I see what's happening. I got angry um, at somebody on the TV and what they're doing. Like what now? I recognized it. What could a person do in that moment?
Yeah, so I mean, anger is the expression of some unmet need in ourselves, and we have to get in touch with that need in order to correctly understand the emotion and address the unmet need in some way, whatever that might be. And we need to have the experience of something more satisfying than just that immediate superficial kick that we get with the burst of righteous indignation. I mentioned an article in the book that says that this chemical burst we get in our brain with the surge of righteous indignation is as addictive as opioids, right? So you see how pervasive the opioid crisis is people are so stressed out. They just need a little release valve, some little bit of peace. This is the quickest, easiest way. Well, so is anger and righteous indignation. And it's doing something to our brain chemistry that's very addictive. And, just like if you're addicted to anything else, if you're addicted to smoking or this or that, like you got to eat healthy, you got to start exercising to the point where the thought of smoking a cigarette is just disgusting because now you're investing all this time trying to jog and you're so short of breath because you're still smoking here and there or whatever, right? Gradually, the healthy habit displaces the unhealthy one. And hopefully you form a attraction to the good that outweighs. You drive out one nail with another, so to speak, as Bernard speaks about. So, yeah, I think practically another factor, this is something that I ran across recently. Apparently, we're kind of hardwired to pay more attention to negative emotion than positive. And, it takes apparently 3 seconds for shame or rage or fear to be processed by the brain. But for higher, more complex and things like attraction, desire, empathy, validation, for these to register takes 30 to 90 seconds of deliberate attention, right? Like how often do you receive a compliment and just kind of blow it off and it doesn't really sink in, it doesn't get traction, you don't really enjoy it, you don't really give it much credit, you just go on to the next thing. They don't really know, and you just kind of brush it off, right? Well, then you're not really fully tasting your life. We have to be very deliberate about allowing the good things and interactions that we have. We have to be very deliberate about letting them sink in, assimilating them, digesting them. That's one of the luxuries and gifts of monastic life is that you have the space to assimilate and fully taste your life, you know. So I think that deliberately paying attention to those good things that come our way is one of the best ways to offset our addiction to rancor and grievance.
Well, thanks for that. Yeah, we can consider that for a while and chew on it. Yeah, with that, I think that's easy to grasp. Anybody who's received a compliment, right? It happens so often. It's like, nice shirt. Yeah, this thing, like it's 10 years old. I got it at Goodwill or something. And it's just not really even the consideration of it. And it just, no, it's not.
Yeah,
It
and
just
even if
kind
it's
of totally
not,
blocked.
yeah, even if it's not that nice a shirt, the person's expressing kindness or something like, to
Yeah,
appreciate that they could have said nothing or they could have said something. Yeah.
yeah, right. So yeah, I think that's a good turn into maybe you can share a poem with us, round it out from there.
Okay, can I share one more short story before the
Oh yeah,
poem?
absolutely.
So
Go ahead.
I mentioned this Enlightened Heart, and that was probably the first place that I read Ryokan, who was a 19th century Japanese monk. And as you mentioned, I've got a co-translation of some of his poems coming out before long from Monkfish books. And he was really terrific. He was kind of a holy fool, Ryokan, and very gifted poet. But there's a beautiful story told about him, which I relate in the book, which is a great example of this kind of not judging that's closer to us in time and by a great poet in this case. So his brother was having trouble with his teenage son, Ryokan's nephew, and he asks if Ryokan, as a holy man, would talk to him. So he says, "Sure, come up to my cottage for the week." And so the father and son come up and spend the week with Ryokan, and they're out in nature and fishing and enjoying a nice time out in the mountains. But the whole time, Ryokan doesn't say anything to reproach the teenage boy, and the father's getting a little anxious or irritated that he hasn't said anything to him yet. And their time together comes to an end. And as they're saying goodbye, the boy bends down to tie up the sandal strap of Ryokan, which has come unfastened, and he feels something wet on the back of his neck. And here is the old man weeping over him, and the tears streaming down the back of the boy's neck. And he realizes the suffering that he's caused and how unjudging and how loving his uncle is, and hasn't said a word to him all week. And precisely that moves him to change his life. He's struck to the heart and he makes a change and goes forward in a new way. And this approach, I mean, you could say, well, what if he didn't change? Or, I mean, but that's exactly the risk involved in respecting another's freedom. You show gratuitous, unconditional love, hoping to awaken a similarly gratuitous response, motivated by gratitude and freedom rather than any kind of coercion or moralism.
Thanks for sharing that one too. Yeah, yeah, I love these little stories. I mean, it's because they're so memorable too, and easy to grasp. Thanks for that. Yeah, and then you could proceed with your poem.
Okay, so this is a short poem called Constellation. In sedge hats, three Japanese women, spread apart like stars, crouch on Tea Garden Drive, run gravel through sifters, tug each delicate weed from the root. Overnight, Chinese balloon flowers pop clusters of light purple.
Excellent. Thank you. Is there a place people can get this book that's preferable?
Liturgical Press is the press, so on their website you can get it there.
And I'll put a link to the book so people can check it out. I had a great time talking with you today.
Likewise.
Um, Look forward to getting into some more of your work and hopefully talk to you again soon.
Okay, thanks, Aaron.